Welcome back to Business Week. I'm joined now by Arise business analyst Bode Oshosami from London, and also here in the Lagos studio, Tomiwa Aladekomo, tech guru and CEO of Big Cabal Media. They're a Nigerian digital media company creating super engaging content that African youth audiences love via two platforms, Tech Cabal and Zikogo. Great to have you on the show, Tomiwa.
Thank you for having me.
Also great to see you over there in London, Bode. It's been a while.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, so Bode, I wanted to ask, we've seen Brent crude prices, WTI, reach like a decade highs, almost a decade high of $90 a barrel after Russia and Saudi extended production cuts. So I guess my question is, Russia and Saudi have really become a focus point in terms of a big driver in this seizing of oil prices. What's your take on how the market is receiving that?
Well, we did get the usual knee-jerk reaction because of these cuts. Global supply down by 1.3 million barrels per day until the end of the year. What had been expected was an extension for a month, but instead of a monthly extension, we understand that they want to take this till the end of the year. But it's still likely that some announcements might be eased lower or even be recalled during the so-called monthly reviews, but certainly the global economy cannot deal with higher oil prices or the effect of a renewed inflationary spike, of course, squeezing customers and endangering the uncertain nascent economic recovery. The fuel price inflation situation has provided Biden's Republican opponents already with attack lines ahead of next year's election, as they blame the White House for prioritizing climate policy over domestic oil output. And like I said, the last thing central banks need is higher oil prices, adding to inflationary pressures, which will upend the monetary stability and downward inflation they have labored for years to achieve. Saudi Arabia say they want stable oil markets, which will be achieved by investments in exploration, which requires an attractive price. But critics say Saudi monarchy is holding the world ransom to pay for its costly Vision 2030 reform project and other projects, from the concept city, investing in Spanish telecom, buying superstar footballers and chateaus in France. I think we'll see how it goes. My guess is the US, of course, they've really almost depleted their strategic reserves. They're selling an emergency gasoline reserve set up in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, doing all they can. And if you look at the data, the number of active drilling rigs in the US rose by 1, rebounding to 632 this week. It's still tight. And US inventory was also down last week by 6.3 million barrels per day from the previous week. So Brent is over 90, but my guess is it would come down. I think mid-80s is where it's likely to be. One single player cannot really dominate the dynamics to take the prices up. That's not sustainable.
Yes, indeed. Interesting to see that the Saudi STC Group is actually acquiring this Telefonica company. So clearly awash with cash. But one player here that's also equally important, Tomiwa, is China. And growth has been a bit sluggish in that economy. China is doing lots of things now. It's banning iPhones. I mean, what's your take on what is coming out of the Chinese market?
I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, obviously, all of this was triggered by the US sort of banning China's ability to invest, produce sort of certain high-tech components using US technology. And that ban's happened over the last sort of year, the last 2 years, as they've kind of, this sort of almost Cold War between the US and China in terms of technology. And it has kind of backfired on the US in the sense that now China has shown a capacity to really sort of like create the same kind of chips that the US banned them from having access to. And so the new phone that Huawei just released this week is a fierce competitor.
I think that's
with
the
foldable
iPhone. Mate, the Mate Pro or something.
Like, beautiful phone, tech capacity-wise, it's almost approaching the slimness of the chips that they're manufacturing, is almost approaching what it is that the US is producing for its own iPhones and for high-tech gadgets like that. And so it's an interesting battle. And I think for Nigeria, it definitely sort of like, it points a direction in terms of a place where you have to have some capacity to manufacture yourself. Otherwise, you have no ability to control what happens to you in the world. And so it's like the US can dictate policy and say, you're not going to have access to these things. And China is just like, you know what? We have the technology, we have the science capability, we have the manufacturing capability. We will build to the capacity to build these things with our own tech. We don't need you.
Yeah.
And that's really when a country sort of like has the ability to control its fate when you've invested enough in your own people, your own processes to actually be able to sort of determine what you put to the market and where you play.
Yeah,
and, so
there's even an interesting dynamic here because we know Huawei Technologies invested even in Nigeria, doing all sorts of construction projects in Nigeria. So this kind of almost proxy tension between China and the West is playing out in so many different continents around the world. And I know Moonshot, you're launching Moonshot, which is meant to be the biggest tech conference. So these are sorts of things that will be on the agenda for Moonshot come October.
Absolutely. So the Moonshot Conference is our attempts to bring together all the most interesting players doing work in Nigeria and across Africa in the tech ecosystem. Coming off our conversation about sort of like China and technology, our sense is that over the next decade, the biggest driver of growth, the biggest driver of productivity, the biggest driver of high quality jobs across Nigeria, across Africa, will be driven by technology. And so it's critical that all business people across sectors are paying attention to what's happening in that space. Tech Cabal's been covering the tech ecosystem for a decade now. We started publishing in March of 2013. And we speak to all the most important investors, all the most important startups, the big technology companies, the telcos, the banks across the continent, understanding what it is that they're doing. And so this conference, we're bringing together some of those players to talk about what's most exciting, what's most interesting, what's the work that they're doing. Our partners include Sabi, which is digitizing the informal economy. They are an insanely ambitious and aggressive company. They've gone from $0 to $500 million in gross transaction values in about 18 months. We have Flutterwave, obviously one of the most famous companies on the continent.
Part of the India delegation, right?
Part of the India delegation, one of our first and sort of largest unicorns. Again, changing the way payments, changing the way transactions work across the ecosystem, across the continent. And all of that stuff affects, we always think about tech companies as if like they operate in a silo. But the work that they do affects, they create jobs across industries. They make it possible for merchants to do things that they couldn't do before. So they enable the economy in a lot of really important and interesting ways. We have PiggyVest joining us, and again, one of just aggressive and ambitious, really savings and financial tech company. And we have, joining us in terms of speakers, a really exciting lineup. We have the new Minister of Comms, Digital and Tech joining us. We have Lagos State Commissioner also joining us, and.
So basically, it's going to be a big one, and this is October 11 and 12, and you're going to be doing quite a lot for startups, people who want to kind of go down the entrepreneurial route.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have workshops, we have master classes led by some of these people from these great startups. Yeah. We have a battlefield in which startups get to pitch for an opportunity to win prizes and to just showcase the work that they've been doing to international investors.
Fantastic. I mean, we'll come back and talk a bit more about digital economy. But Bode, I wanted to bring you here now because we saw that US stocks were rising, and there was this suggestion that the tech sector was the one kind of propping up US stocks. Is that really still going to be the case in the short term going forward?
Well, it's not just a suggestion, it's where the data is pointing. Technology stocks in the first half of the year led most indices on the artificial intelligence growth narrative. NVIDIA was the best stock in the first half, driven by this AI wave, up 6% in August, growing over 240% year to date. The uptick abated a bit in August. Most indices finished last week down, but the fact remains that for the month of August, technology stocks also led all the three major US indices. If you look at the Dow Systems, was up 10.2%. It led there. S&P 500 Arista Networks, which makes networking hardware, led that index with a gain of 25.9% in August. And also in the NASDAQ, a cloud-based seller productivity software, Atlassian, led with a surge of 12.2%. So it's the familiar themes: artificial intelligence, cloud computing, enterprise infrastructure, especially in equipment. But one thing I must add is, we did see a big loser in Apple, which is interesting given that everybody's really looking forward to this iPhone 15 event on Tuesday. 3 events that would shape next week in the tech sector. Apple's launching the updated iPhone 15. Will that make a difference, given that I think people are a bit more, they're not bringing out opening their wallet? we used to. And the ARM IPO is going to price on Wednesday night, with ARM trading on the NASDAQ more than 5 times oversubscribed, despite the fact that ARM is reaching for a value in line with AI intelligence and the AI giant NVIDIA, but without the growth. So it just shows you how technology presently is. And thirdly, the Department of Justice will finally bring its 3-year-old antitrust case against Google to trial in federal court, and that's also on Tuesday. But if you do look at the indices, NASDAQ was up 0.09% yesterday. Dow was also up 0.22%. It's been a good day, but I can see that apart from tech, the oil companies predictably are doing well.
Yeah.
Chevron was also 0.34%, ExxonMobil up 1.46%, Shell up 0.02. Apple managed to inch up 0.35, Amazon up 0.28%, Microsoft up 1.32, Meta is down 0.26% yesterday, NVIDIA actually down 1.45%. So it's looking pretty mixed as we approach a very eventful week.
Yes, indeed. And, you know, we've always had that sort of conversation around who is going to lead the charge on global equity markets, the big oil and gas players or the tech stocks, which is also why the timing of China's ban ahead of this new Apple model launch was quite suspect. But I'm sure a lot of observers will have a lot to say on that. So, Bode, we're going to move now to another story quickly. September 6th marked the 100 days of the Tinubu administration. What is your assessment, and what feelers may you be getting from investors about how well his economic policies are impacting the confidence in the Nigerian market?
Well, the first thing I should say is that one of the key roles of a successful leader in a change situation is to sustain the appetite for desired change. And you shouldn't confuse people wanting better personal circumstance with wanting a broader, long-term change to prosper the wider population, especially in a way that lifts more out of poverty. So the good leader must be focused on the long-term good of the country. Some say that observers have set a low bar, but we should also know that the gap between where Nigeria is today and where we should be has significantly widened over the last decade. Still, Tinubu has demonstrated courage, apparently not daunted by an intimidating in-tray. Major challenges on legitimacy, many skeletons in the closet still waiting to be buried. Also, it's fair to accept that he's not the architect of the problems he's trying to deal with, and the analytics to manage solutions and manage the pace can't be easy, otherwise it will have been done. But let me just talk about something that's important. I should warn that political strongman tactics and a hefty loyalty base will only take you a little distance. It won't suffice. You really, to leave a good legacy, the focus has to be on building and strengthening the institutions, enhancing efficiency of governance, plugging the leakages. And of course, you know that governance is now going to be very politically costly. Look at what we've been seeing in the Central African region. But just a few examples of where governance needs to be tackled. We need a non-departmental independent public body, for example, to provide rigorous independent economic forecasts, be an independent analyst or watchdog over public finances. In the UK, they call them the OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility. The Bureau of Statistics needs a lot of help. To navigate change without data is like someone flying with a bad compass. It's just not going to work.
But
and then if areas, there's a lot still to be done. One thing that was said by, I think it was Bismarck in his latest financial derivatives outlook, it says there's a glimmer of hope as Nigerian policymakers have no choice but to stop making irrational decisions. So we hope the glimmer of hope.
Indeed. I mean, it's a lot of humor, but quite a lot of sense in what Mr. Bismarck said. And thanks for sharing that. You know, and Tomiwa, I often wonder whether tech will be our savior and the digital economy. There's a huge focus now on that with the appointment of Bosun Tijani, who's quite known in your ecosystem. What's your take on what those priorities should be and how he's doing so far? Is he sending the right signals out?
Absolutely. I think definitely a major announcement, a major appointment. And I think he's starting out on the right foot. So there's a lot of engagement with the existing players within the system, with the agencies, and there's a lot of bringing in the ecosystem in to kind of support, and to support rather than to supplement, which is quite important because you don't want to go in there, you don't want to threaten the existing system. But I think there's a lot of work for him to do. He's starting off on the right foot. There's a lot to be done in terms of digitizing government and the way sort of like the government works. There is a lot to ensuring that we are supporting our own ecosystem. We are supporting sort of Nigerian technology companies.
So what type of support are you talking about? I mean, what would be your pain points as a big cabal media CEO?
Okay, well, so the first pain point with any administration is always just the macro. It's hard to build profitable, strong companies in a declining economy.
Yeah.
And like Mr. Buddy has just said, this administration has inherited a lot of sort of like of pain. And so we've got to get the economy moving. And so that's a really, really important thing. But specifically on the digital side, there's a lot of stuff. At the moment, a lot of tech companies are domiciled in the US because that's where it's easiest to get investment into those companies. We need investment policies that make it easier for investment to come directly into the Nigerian economy. You need to make the rules for those companies to work a lot clearer, a lot easier. Over the last couple of years, we've seen some policy making that has been a bit adversarial, especially as the fintech companies have started to sort of change the shape of the economy.
Was the ban on crypto one of those?
I think
not to be controversial.
I must say that I've never been the biggest crypto fan in the world, and I think that a lot of the applications have still been somewhat dodgy. But I do think that outright bans are frequently problematic and they're damaging to companies where engagement can be a lot more productive. And so there's a lot of work to make sure that we are speaking to the companies, to make sure that we are bringing the players to the table to talk together. The Nigerian Startup Act getting passed a year ago was a big step. We're almost a year out from that and it has an implementation still very, very slow. So that needs to get implemented because a lot of the work that will do and a lot of what that will enable for the ecosystem is, again, enabling investment to come from across the world, making it a lot more interesting. It's enabling startups to get registered easier, to get benefits like tax breaks, etc., which are critical things for companies that are just trying to get off the ground. And so I think there's a lot of that work that's ready for him to do. The trip to India is quite interesting, and the Minister of Comms and Digital was on that trip speaking to a lot of Indian companies. India, obviously, quite ahead of us in terms of their technology ecosystem. And they've built a massive outsourcing industry, which is an opportunity for us. We're looking to employ millions of young people. And those kind of jobs are going to be critical. And so can he move the needle on those kind of things? Can he take examples from them, build relationships with them to bring some of those companies here and to encourage us to build an economy that can serve the world. I think one of the problems that we do think about is we say Nigeria is the market, Africa is a massive market, Nigeria has 200 million people, but the truth of the matter is the world is the market. And we have technical talent here, we have the ability to build more technical talent. I think a really important initiative that the minister has talked about is training 1 million sort of technical people, whether developers or across a range of digital and technology skills. And that's really critical work because there is a massive shortage of technical talent across the world. And we can provide that if we can educate people quickly and efficiently enough. So that's the work.
And speaking of India, actually, Bode, you know, I saw images of President Bola Tinubu arriving at the G20. The G20 has officially invited the African Union to that grouping. What impact do you think President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's presence, or at least the African Union, you know, what's the strategy there? I find this very intriguing. I don't know if you had any thoughts to share with us around that.
Well, it's interesting, definitely, although very much overdue now that the AU African Union, the 55-member group, is now a full member, not just attending based on an invitation. Bola Ahmed Tinubu obviously needs to be wary of activity traps and choose his battles wisely, and I think he's doing that. It's not uncommon to confuse intentions, activities, and best efforts with progress. So I think you need to have clear themes that you are going after, clear outcomes. And I liked the idea of this intensified business thing, the 48-man group. But going back to the G20, the challenge, I think, initially was in getting consensus. I understand the 38-page draft couldn't agree on what to say about Ukraine, and I think that was eventually resolved. There is a line that was in the Bali summit that said most members strongly condemned the war. That isn't repeated in this year's draft. And then they've added a phrase which welcomes efforts to reach a comprehensive, just and durable peace in Ukraine. But it's not an easy job. On global taxation, rules will differ. Different countries have different positionings in the global value chain, and how you tax will certainly affect the fiscal position of one at the expense of the other. Climate change resolutions can be a lever for economic advancement for Western countries with the technology. It could slow down developing nations who still want to use more affordable fossil fuel solutions. The US think Ukraine is the most important issue. The southern economies see Ukraine diverting attention from the more important issue to them of supporting weaker economies to address a new rising poverty and debt distress. So it's tricky. For the US, they are really pushing the World Bank's lending capacity for middle-income and low-income countries by about 25 billion. It will actually reach up to 100 billion. What we're trying to do is to set up, for example, the multinational rail and ports deal was announced today, linking the Middle East and South Asia. On the sidelines of the summit, as Biden wants to counter China's Belt and Road push on global infrastructure by pitching
Thanks, Bode.
But Xi Jinping is definitely not going to be impressed with all this.
Yeah, indeed. Quite a laundry list of things there. And, it's been so great chatting with Bode Oshosami, a Rise business analyst, and Aladekomo on several things. The digital economy, that's a big one and will be a focus for Nigeria going forward. And glad to see it take center stage on this China chip. We look forward to getting the outcomes of that. And of course, keeping an eye on global oil prices, because that affects a lot of things, even our digital businesses, because you buy fuel, you buy diesel, you buy petrol. So thanks a lot for coming on the show, Tomiwa Aladekomo and Bode Oshosami.